Sometimes a bow becomes more than a weapon. It becomes a language, a prayer, a confession. For Kale, it had become all three. He had spent 17 years learning to speak through the curve of yew wood and the whisper of feathered shafts, and in that time, he had forgotten how to speak any other way. The forest knew his name, though no human had spoken it in months. The trees remembered the weight of his footsteps, the particular rhythm of his breathing when he drew back the string, the soft exhale that preceded every kill. He was not a murderer. He was a translator, converting the desperate needs of survival into the elegant geometry of flight and impact. His arrows did not miss because missing was a luxury he had never been able to afford. The village that had raised him existed now only in the cartography of his scars. Fire had taken the buildings. Disease had taken the people. What remained was Kale, walking the spaces between civilization and wilderness, belonging fully to neither. Some nights, he would find himself standing at the edge of clearings, watching distant chimney smoke curl toward indifferent stars, and he would feel something in his chest that might have been loneliness if he had allowed himself to name it. But naming things gave them power, and he had learned long ago that power unchecked becomes a predator. So he moved through the world like a rumor, like a half-remembered dream, leaving nothing behind but the clean bones of his prey and the occasional arrow lodged in a tree trunk where a bandit had once stood. The weight of solitude had carved grooves into his soul, channels through which silence flowed like cold water. He had made peace with this, or so he believed, until the night the woman appeared. The Thornwood stretched across the northern territories like a scar that had never learned to heal. Ancient oaks twisted into shapes that seemed to mock the very concept of growth, their branches reaching not toward sunlight, but toward each other, creating a canopy so dense that noon looked like dusk, and dusk looked like the inside of a closed coffin. Kale had been traveling its edges for 3 days, following the deer trails that wound between the corrupted trunks, gathering the medicinal mushrooms that grew only in soil touched by decay. The air here tasted different than anywhere else he had traveled. It carried notes of iron and old rain, of secrets buried so deep they had fossilized into stone. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves that had been falling, it seemed, since the beginning of time, layer upon layer creating a soft cushion that swallowed sound the way a drunk swallows regret. Birds avoided this place. Even the insects seemed hesitant, their usual chorus reduced to occasional clicks and chirps that felt more like warnings than songs. Kale did not fear the Thornwood, but he respected it the way one respects a sleeping beast. You did not poke it. You did not challenge it. You moved through its domain with humility and hoped it did not notice you. The village of Mirren lay somewhere on the other side. A 3-day journey through the trees, if one knew the paths. Kale knew them. He had memorized the landmarks, the subtle changes in vegetation that marked safe passage from treacherous ground. But knowing a path and walking it were different things, and tonight, with the moon hidden behind clouds thick as wool, even familiar routes felt foreign. He had made camp in a hollow formed by 3 fallen giants, their root systems creating walls that blocked the wind and provided cover from anything watching from above. His fire was small, fed sparingly with dry wood that produced more heat than smoke. The mushrooms hung drying from a makeshift rack. Tomorrow, he would reach Mirren, trade them for supplies, and disappear back into the wilderness before anyone could ask questions he did not want to answer. That was the plan. But plans, like arrows, sometimes find targets they were never meant to hit. Before we continue, tell me, what faraway frontier are you watching from? The snap of a twig is a small thing, easily dismissed, easily attributed to settling wood or nocturnal animals going about their mysterious business. But Kale had survived long enough to know that dismissing small things was how people became corpses. His hand found his bow before his conscious mind registered the movement, fingers wrapping around the familiar curve with the intimacy of a lover's touch. He did not rise from his seated position against the root wall. Rising would create motion, and motion attracted eyes. Instead, he became stone, became shadow, became the held breath before a scream. The fire painted dancing shapes across the hollow, each flicker a potential betrayal of his position. He should have let it die down. Careless. The thought surfaced and sank, irrelevant now. Another sound reached him, softer than the first, but wrong in a way that made his spine tighten. It was a rhythm, a pattern. Footsteps. Human footsteps, though they stumbled like the feet belonged to someone drunk or injured or both. Cale's eyes had adjusted to the darkness beyond his fire's glow, and he saw the shadow before he saw the shape it belonged to. She emerged from between two oak trunks like something the forest had decided to spit out. A woman, though the word felt insufficient for what stood before him. Her dress had once been fine, that much was clear from the embroidery barely visible beneath layers of mud, and what might have been blood. Her hair hung in matted curtains around a face that was all angles and desperation, cheekbones sharp enough to cut, eyes too wide, too wild. But it was her mouth that drew his attention. It moved constantly, forming words that produced no sound, a silent prayer or curse or plea that went on, interrupted only by the harsh rasp of her breathing. She saw his fire, saw him. For a moment that stretched like taffy in a torturer's hands, they simply stared at each other across the flames. Then she moved toward him with a speed that belied her apparent exhaustion, and Cale's arrow tracked her movement automatically, the string half drawn, the point, seeking her heart with patient inevitability. She stopped, raised her hands, palms outward, the universal gesture of surrender. And then she did something that would haunt him for the rest of his days. She leaned close, so close he could smell the forest rot clinging to her skin, and she whispered. The words came out broken, shattered, as if speech itself had become a foreign language she was struggling to remember. They took my voice. Her actual voice, he realized with a chill, was barely louder than leaves rubbing together. Something had damaged it, reduced it to this ruined whisper. They're coming. Please, please help me. His arrow remained steady, but his certainty wavered. Who's coming? The woman's eyes darted to the darkness behind her, and the terror in them was so raw, so complete, that Cale felt it echo in his own chest. The hollow men, she breathed. I escaped, but they don't. They never stop hunting. They'll be here by dawn, she swallowed, and he saw tears cutting tracks through the grime on her face. They want what I stole from them, what I hid. Before he could respond, she collapsed, her body folding in on itself like a puppet with severed strings. Cale caught her before she hit the ground, and as his arms wrapped around her too thin frame, he felt something hard pressed against her chest beneath the ruined dress. Something she had protected even in unconsciousness. Something that, judging by the distant sound of drums that had just begun to pulse through the forest, others were willing to kill to reclaim. The night had grown teeth, and they were coming closer. He had perhaps 3 hours until dawn. The woman, whoever she was, had passed from consciousness into something deeper, a sleep that bordered on absence, her breathing so shallow he had to press his fingers to her throat to confirm she still lived. The drums had not stopped. If anything, they had grown more insistent, a heartbeat for the hunting pack that tracked her, and now, by extension, him. Cale worked quickly. He scattered the fire, burying the coals beneath damp earth, until not even embers remained. The darkness that replaced the flames was absolute, but he had learned long ago to navigate by touch and memory, by the subtle language of air currents and the map of sounds. His hands found his pack, secured his bow across his back, and returned to the unconscious woman. She weighed nothing. Starvation had hollowed her out, left behind only the framework of a person. He lifted her easily, cradling her against his chest the way one might carry a child, and began to move through the forest. The object hidden beneath her dress pressed against his ribs with every step. He wanted to know what it was. He needed to not know, because knowing would make him complicit, would transform him from rescuer to accomplice. The drums seemed to track his movement, adjusting their rhythm, their direction. Coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps not. The hollow men. He had heard the name whispered in taverns, spoken by traders who had ventured too far into the Thornwood and returned with haunted eyes and missing fingers. A cult, some said. Bandits who had lost their humanity to something ancient and hungry that lived at the forest's heart. Others claimed they were not men at all, but something that were men like clothing, discarding bodies when they became too damaged to serve. Cale had dismissed the stories as the usual frontier mythology, the kind of tales people told to explain the random cruelty of a world that did not care about their suffering. Now, With the drums growing louder, and the woman's ruined voice echoing in his memory, he was less certain. The ground beneath his feet began to slope upward. He recognized this terrain, a ridge that ran along the northern edge of the hollow, providing a vantage point from which he could survey the approaching threat. His legs burned with the effort of climbing while carrying his burden. But he did not slow. Slowing was dying, and he was not ready to die. Not tonight. Not like this. He reached the ridge as the first gray hints of dawn began to bleed through the canopy. Below, in the hollow where his camp had been, shadows moved. They were wrong, those shadows. They moved too smoothly, with a liquid grace that human bodies should not possess. He counted 7. No, 8. 9. The number kept changing, as if the shadows themselves were uncertain how many bodies they inhabited. One of them knelt where his fire had been, pressing fingers to the buried coals. The head turned, slowly, inexorably, until it faced directly toward the ridge where Cale crouched with the woman in his arms. Distance should have made it impossible. The darkness should have hidden him completely. But he felt the weight of that gaze like a physical pressure against his chest, and he understood with terrible clarity that whatever tracked them did not rely on human senses. The woman stirred in his arms. Her eyes opened, and even in the minimal light, he could see the pupils were dilated to the point of consuming the iris, leaving behind only black pools that reflected nothing. "They see through me," she whispered. "They marked me. I thought distance would break the connection." But she didn't finish. She didn't have to. Cale made a decision that would either save them or doom them both. He set the woman down, propping her against a tree, and he removed the bough from his back. The shadows below had begun to climb. They moved through the forest with the efficiency of wolves, spreading out to encircle the ridge, cutting off escape routes with predatory precision. 9 targets. He had 12 arrows. The math was not in his favor, but math had never been his language. He selected his first arrow by touch alone, feeling the familiar weight, the slight imperfection in the fletching that he had never bothered to correct, because imperfections made each shaft unique, identifiable. The creature that had knelt by his fire was leading the ascent, moving faster than the others, eager for the kill. Cale drew. He did not aim the way other archers aimed, with conscious calculation of distance and windage and the trajectory that physics demanded. He simply knew where the arrow needed to be, the way he knew where his own hands were. Without looking, the string sang, the shadow stumbled, and for one heartbeat, Cale saw its true form. Not a man, not entirely, something that had been a man once, before something hollowed it out and filled the cavity with darkness and hunger. His arrow protruded from what should have been its chest, and black liquid that was not quite blood seeped around the shaft. It should have fallen. It did not fall. It smiled, and the smile split its face open for wider than any human smile could, revealing teeth that went back and back and back into a throat that seemed to have no end. The ridge became a killing floor, though whose death it would witness remained uncertain. Cale's second arrow flew before the first had finished its impossible non-work, and this time he aimed for the head. The shadow's skull came apart in a spray of that black not blood, and finally, mercifully, the body collapsed, twitching in the leaf litter like a beheaded chicken. So they could die. They just died harder than anything natural. He had 11 arrows. 8 remaining targets. The woman had pulled herself upright, using the tree for support, and her hands were fumbling with the front of her dress, the hard object he had felt. She was retrieving it. "What are you doing?" he demanded, knocking another arrow as 2 more shadows crested the ridge from different angles. "Ending this," she whispered. "One way or another." Her hand emerged holding a stone. Even in the gray half-light of approaching dawn, it glowed with an inner luminescence, soft blue-green like bioluminescent ocean water, like foxfire, like something that had no business existing in a world bound by sensible rules. The shadows froze, all of them, simultaneously, as if controlled by a single will that had just received new instructions. Their heads turned toward the stone, and Cale saw hunger in those movements, desire so intense it had become gravity. "Don't let them have it," the woman breathed. "Whatever happens, don't let them have it." Then she threw the stone, not at the shadows, not at Cale, but into the forest, into the darkness between the trees where dawn's light had not yet penetrated. She threw it with the desperate strength of someone who had nothing left to lose. The shadows moved as one, abandoning the ridge, abandoning their prey, flowing down the slope toward the stone's landing point with fluid urgency. All except one. The last shadow remained on the ridge, its attention fixed not on the stone, but on the woman, and Cale understood with horrible clarity that this one had different orders. It wanted what she had hidden in her mind, the knowledge of where she had truly concealed whatever the stone represented. The stone was a decoy, a brilliant, desperate decoy. But if this creature reached her, the deception would unravel. Cale placed himself between them, arrow drawn, breathing steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. The shadow studied him with something that might have been amusement. "Little archer," it said, and the voice was raw, layered, as if multiple throats spoke in imperfect unison. "She belongs to us. Step aside, and you may leave with your life." His answer was an arrow through its left eye. The creature screamed, a sound that contained multitudes of agony. And Cale was already moving, already knocking his next arrow, already putting distance between himself and the thrashing thing that refused to die. 3 more arrows, 3 more impacts, throat, heart, the other eye. Finally, silence. The woman had not moved. She stood against her tree, watching him with those 2 dark eyes. And something in her expression had changed. The desperation remained, but beneath it, he glimpsed something else. Hope, perhaps, or simply the absence of the certainty of death. "They'll realize the stone was a fake," she whispered. "They'll come back." Cale nodded, retrieving arrows that could be salvaged, wiping black fluid from the shafts. "Then we need to be gone before they do." He took her arm, less gently this time, urgency overriding courtesy. "The real one. Where is it?" She was silent for a long moment, and he thought she might refuse to answer. Then, "Mirren. I grew up there, before everything. There's a temple, abandoned now, on the eastern edge. I hid it in the altar stone. It's the only place I knew they wouldn't look, because they believe their power has corrupted all sacred spaces." She met his eyes, and he saw the truth of her words written in the lines of exhaustion that mapped her face. "Please. If I don't survive, someone has to destroy it. The stone is a key. The Hollow Men want to open a door that should never be open. If they succeed." She trailed off, but Cale could imagine the rest. Doors worked both ways, and whatever waited on the other side of this one was the source of the darkness that had transformed men into shadows. Mirren was 2 days away, through the heart of the Thornwood. The Hollow Men knew the forest better than any human could. They would be hunted every step of the way. And yet, as the first true rays of dawn broke through the canopy, Cale found himself nodding. Not because he was brave, not because he was noble, but because the alternative was to walk away and spend the rest of his life wondering what had come through the door he had allowed to open. Some prices were too high, even for survival. "Can you walk?" he asked. The woman smiled, and despite everything, it transformed her face into something almost beautiful. "I can try." They moved into the light together, leaving the carnage of the ridge behind. The Thornwood resisted their passage as if the forest itself had chosen sides. Roots that had lain dormant for centuries seemed to rise from the earth, specifically to catch their feet. Branches whipped at exposed skin with malicious accuracy. The air grew thick, humid, difficult to breathe. Cale led, cutting a path through the undergrowth with his hunting knife, while the woman, who had finally told him her name was Elara, followed in his wake. She spoke in fragments during their brief rest stops, filling in the gaps of her story with whispered confessions. She had been a scholar once, attached to a lord's household in the eastern provinces. Her specialty was ancient texts, dead languages, the kind of knowledge that most considered useless until it became the only thing standing between the world and catastrophe. She had been the one to translate the ritual that the Hollow Men needed. They had taken her, kept her alive for months while they extracted information piece by piece, never realizing that she was also memorizing their weaknesses, their patterns, their obsessions. The escape had cost her everything. Her voice, damaged by screaming, her strength, sapped by starvation, her faith in a world that made sense. But she had succeeded in taking the key before she fled, hiding it in the one place they could not conceive of a corrupted vessel like herself returning to. The temple was my grandmother's, she whispered as they rested beside a stream, drinking water that tasted of moss and minerals. I was dedicated there as a child. Whatever darkness they poured into me, some part of that dedication remains. It protects the stone from their sight. Kale listened, processing, calculating. If the key needed to be destroyed rather than simply hidden, that implied it could be destroyed. How do we end it? He asked. Fire, she said. But not ordinary fire. The temple has a sacred flame, or it did. Eternal, they called it. Fed by the mountain's heart. If it still burns, if we can reach it. She didn't need to finish. The variables were multiplying, the uncertainties compounding, and beneath it all, the drums had returned, distant but persistent, tracking them through territory that should have been impossible to track. They moved again, pushing harder, faster, driven by the knowledge that stopping meant dying and dying meant losing. Dawn of the second day found them at the edge of a clearing that Kale recognized with a mixture of relief and dread. Mirren lay on the other side, its thatched roofs visible through the morning mist, its chimney smoke rising toward an indifferent sky. But between them and the village, the hollow men waited. They had anticipated this route, this destination. 7 of them remained, arranged in a loose semicircle that blocked every approach to the village. They did not move, did not speak, simply stood with the patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. Alara's hand found his arm, her grip weak, but insistent. The eastern approach, she whispered. Through the river. It's shallow this time of year, and the water. They don't like water. It disrupts whatever binds them to their stolen bodies. It was information she had not shared before, perhaps because she had not been certain, perhaps because she had been saving it for exactly this moment. Kale studied the terrain with new eyes. The river curved around Mirren's eastern boundary, providing irrigation for the fields that fed the village. If they could reach it without being seen, if the water truly offered protection, they might slip past the blockade while the shadows waited for an approach that would never come. Can you swim? He asked. Alara's laugh was barely audible, a ghost of humor. I can float. Will that suffice? It would have to. They retreated into the forest, circling wide, losing hours they could not afford to lose. The drums followed them, always present, never quite catching up. The hollow men remained at their posts, confident in their trap, not yet realizing that their quarry had chosen a different game. The river appeared through the trees like a promise, its surface silver in the afternoon light. Kale helped Alara into the water, feeling her shiver as the cold embraced her. He followed, holding his bow above the surface, trusting the current to carry them toward the village. They drifted in silence, 2 pieces of flotsam on a river that did not care about their struggles. The water smelled of life, of the endless cycle of growth and decay that made all mortal concerns seem small. Kale found himself thinking about the village that had raised him, the fire that had taken it, the years of solitude that had followed. He had believed himself beyond connection, beyond the vulnerabilities that came with caring about anything other than survival. Alara's weight against his side, her trust in his ability to deliver her to safety, reminded him that beliefs could be wrong. The temple rose from the eastern edge of Mirren like an accusation against the sky. It was smaller than Kale had imagined, a simple stone structure that had clearly seen better centuries. Moss covered most of its surface. The roof had partially collapsed, leaving the interior open to the elements, but smoke rose from somewhere within. The eternal flame still burned. They emerged from the river on a muddy bank, dripping and exhausted, and impossibly alive. The village proper was quiet, its inhabitants going about their daily routines, unaware of the shadows that waited at their borders. Kale considered warning them, decided against it. The hollow men wanted the key, not random villagers. If he and Alara succeeded, the threat would end. If they failed, a warning would not save anyone. The temple had no door, just an archway that opened into a single room dominated by a stone altar. The flame rose from a hollow in the altar's center, fed by no visible fuel, burning with a light that was somehow more than mere fire. It was warm, yes, but the warmth reached deeper than skin, touched something in Kale's chest that he had thought long dead. Alara approached the altar with the reverence of a child returning home after a long journey. Her hands found the stone's edge, traced patterns he could not see, and something clicked. A compartment opened, hidden so cleverly that even knowing it existed, he could barely perceive its seams. The true key lay inside. It looked nothing like the decoy. Where that stone had glowed with borrowed light, this one seemed to contain darkness, a fragment of void given solid form. Looking at it made his eyes water, made his thoughts scatter. Even in its container, it radiated wrongness. The fire will unmake it, Alara whispered. But it has to be given freely. A sacrifice, not a disposal. She lifted the key, and Kale saw what it cost her. Every step toward the flame bent her forward, as if the void fragment fought against its own destruction. The drums outside had stopped. In the silence, he heard something worse. Footsteps, wet footsteps, approaching from the river. They had followed through the water despite the cost, the pain. They wanted the key badly enough to suffer. Kale turned, arrow knocked, to face the temple entrance. The first hollow man appeared, and he was no longer bothering to wear its human disguise. What entered the temple was darkness given form, a shape that suggested humanity the way a shadow suggests the object that casts it. Wrong. So wrong that his mind tried to reject what his eyes reported. He loosed his arrow. It passed through the creature without effect, clattering against the stone floor behind it. The hollow man smiled its impossible smile and took another step. Behind him, Kale heard Alara struggling toward the flame, heard her whispered prayers in a language he did not recognize. The creature's attention shifted to her, to the key in her hands, and Kale did the only thing he could think to do. He threw himself at it. His body passed through darkness that burned like ice, that tore at something deeper than flesh. He felt pieces of himself being stripped away, memories, hopes, the fundamental structure of his identity. But his momentum carried him into the creature, carried them both backward, out of the temple, into the morning light. The sun touched the hollow man's darkness, and it screamed. Direct sunlight, Kale realized through the haze of pain. They hid from it, hunted at night, moved through shadows. They were vulnerable to it. He forced himself upright, forced his broken body between the creatures and the temple entrance, and he held. The remaining hollow men circled, looking for angles of approach that the sun did not touch, finding none as it rose higher in the sky. And behind him, finally, he heard the sound of destruction. The key touched the eternal flame, and both annihilated each other in a silent explosion of light and darkness that left nothing behind. The hollow men dissolved. Without the key, without the door they had hoped to open, they had no anchor to this world. They came apart like morning mist, leaving behind only the faint smell of old graves and older regret. Kale collapsed on the temple steps, watching the dust of his enemies drift away on the wind. Alara found him there as the sun reached its peak. Her voice was still ruined, might always be ruined, but she was alive, and the world remained whole. You saved everything, she whispered, kneeling beside him. And I don't even know how to thank you. Kale considered the question as the villagers finally emerged from their homes, drawn by the light and the silence and the strange man bleeding on their temple steps. He thought about his years of solitude, his certainty that connection was weakness, his belief that survival was the only victory that mattered. Stay alive, he said finally. Remember what happened here, and if you ever see someone who needs help, don't walk away. It was not eloquent, but it was honest. And honesty was its own kind of arrow, flying true, even when the target seemed impossible. She nodded, and in her eyes, he saw understanding. The story would spread, the warning would persist, and somewhere, in some distant future, another archer would remember that courage meant more than accuracy, that the measure of a life was not how long it lasted, but how it was spent. Kale closed his eyes and let the sun warm his face. And for the first time in 17 years, he did not feel alone.